House will come to order.
The House will come to order. Prayer by the chaplain.
Good morning and good afternoon. Just wanted to take a moment and say thank you for all of our service members and spouses of service members that have served any branch of our military. Our gratitude goes out to you. Also want to express my gratitude to each of you as representatives for the great service that you provide to this state. Your sacrifice of time, conveniences, and certain relationships is certainly recognized and appreciated. Your ability to work with others, having opposing viewpoints, and your perseverance to find solutions is absolutely outstanding. Thank you. Now I invite you to join with me as we say a word of prayer. Gracious Lord, we come before you today asking that you will pave the way for a fruitful afternoon and week. We thank you for the passion exhibited in the various viewpoints represented here, which comprehensively make us a balanced legislature. We pray that this passion will meet with perseverance to find healthy processes that benefit us as Minnesotans in a spirit of maturity, peace, and unity. We pray for those that are tired and discouraged. Pray that you'll give them strength. For the frustrated, please give them a sense of satisfaction. And for those that may even want to give up, please renew their grit. And lastly, we ask for your wisdom and guidance to discharge our areas of service, enhancing our state to become the best it can be in the Union. Amen.
The chaplain for today is Chaplain Captain Michael Golay, assigned to the 319th Air Base Wing at Grand Forks, North Dakota. Pledge of Allegiance. Please remain standing and recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Clerk will take the roll. Clerk will close the roll.
Okay. So I'm closing the roll, all right. Anyone declare a quorum is present? Yep, right now. Quorum is present. Hit the gavel.
Quorum is present. Clerk will read the journal of the preceding day.
Journal of the House, 90th Session, 2018, 83rd day, St. Paul, Minnesota, Thursday, April 19th, 2018.
If there is no objection, further reading of the journal will be dispensed with, and the journal will be approved as corrected by the Chief Clerk. Hearing no objection, the journal is approved as corrected by the Chief Clerk. Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
State your point of personal privilege.
Mr. Speaker and members, today we have some very special guests visiting us who are members of the Kenyan Parliamentary Service Commission. The commission was established to ensure the smooth functioning of the House of Parliament, consisting of the Senate of Kenya and National Assembly of Kenya. Recently, the Kenyan Parliament switched to a bicameral legislature, and the goal of their visit here is to study, observe, and learn about how Minnesota is able to coordinate our legislative functions through a bicameral system. Mr. Speaker and members, I would like to introduce to you our distinguished guest. The Honorable Justin Muturi, Speaker of the Kenya National Assembly and Chairman of the Parliamentary Service Commission. The Honorable Senator Beth Mugo, Member of Parliament, Senate of Kenya. The Honorable Ben Momanyi, Member of Parliament, National Assembly. Mr. Jeremiah Njene, Clerk of the Senate and Secretary of the Parliamentary Service Commission. Mrs. Shadia Farid, Deputy Director and Head of Commission Secretariat. Ms. Veronica Kabadi, Principal Clerk 2 and Parliamentary Service Commission Secretariat. The host of the delegation is Donald Schneider, former Chief Clerk and Director of Operations for the State of Wisconsin. And I might have missed some. Did I miss anybody here? I might have missed some that aren't on my list here. I will apologize for not having those names in front of me. But there will be a meet and greet reception tomorrow from 2:30 to 4 p.m. in room 316 of the Capitol. Do we have Adam Kanan? Is that here? Kanan and Aisha Jemwa Kutana? No? Well, thank you so much. And members, if you could join me in giving them a warm welcome.
Comparison reports. There's a copy of this order of business on each member's desk. If there is no objection, the motions will prevail. Hearing no objections, the motions prevail and the substitutions will be made. Reports of standing committees and divisions. Copy of the order of business has been placed on each member's desk. If there are no objections to the reports will be adopted. Hearing no objections, the reports are adopted. Second reading of House files.
Second reading, House File number 4133.
Second reading. Second reading of Senate files.
Second reading, Senate File Number 2484.
Second reading.
Second reading, Senate File Number 3466.
Second reading.
Second reading, Senate File Number 3596.
Second reading. Introduction of bills. Following House files have been offered for introduction today. The Chief Clerk will report the House files and give them their first reading.
Introduction of first reading of House Files 4451 through 4460.
First reading, House files 4451 through 4460. Messages from the Senate.
Message from the Senate. Mr. Speaker, I hereby announce the passage by the Senate of the following Senate files herewith transmitted. Senate file numbers 2777 and 3673. The message is signed Cal R. Loonan, Secretary of the Senate.
First reading of Senate files.
First reading of Senate file number 2777, an act relating to state government. Pew move that Senate file number 2777 and House file number 3290, now on the General Register, be referred to the Chief Clerk for comparison.
If there are no objections, so ordered.
First reading, Senate file number 3673, an act relating to human services. Johnson B. move that Senate file number 3673 and House file number 3782, now on the General Register, be referred to the Chief Clerk for comparison.
If there are no objections, so ordered.
Alrighty.
Calendar for the day. First bill on the calendar for the day is House File 3389. Clerk will report the file.
House file number 3389, number 1 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to children.
I call upon the member from Anoka, Representative Scott, to introduce her bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this bill reverses the presumption in a child support action, modification action, that a change in law does not constitute a substantial change in circumstances. So this bill does state that such a change in law does constitute a substantial change in circumstances when it meets the criteria for modification in 518A39 and subdivision 2. And with that, I'd be welcome questions.
There are no amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House file number 3389.
Third reading. Discussion to the bill. The member from Hennepin, Representative Pryor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I stand in support of this bill. I know that we have task force out there right now that are working on projects that we have given to them as a legislature, and this is a bill that came out of the work of a task force. And it's people that paid attention to the details of what's in statute now and try to write it a little bit better so that people that have to read our laws can understand our laws. And this clarifies it, and it makes an addition to statute right now that will be beneficial. So I'm in support.
Further discussion. Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Pryor. Yes, this did come out of the Child Support Task Force, and I would encourage people's support. Thank you.
Seeing no further discussion, clerk will take the roll on the bill. Clerk will close the roll. There being 123 ayes and 0 noes, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. Next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 3833. Clerk will report the bill.
House File number 3833, number 2 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to commerce, the second engrossment.
I recognize the member from Rock, Representative Schomacker, to introduce his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. $3 billion. $3 billion is the amount that seniors reportedly lose each year around the country due to financial exploitation. We can all imagine the examples of fraud from the Jamaican lottery scam to the IRS impersonation scams, but even family members of elderly and vulnerable adults that contribute to that $3 billion a year figure. And the impending silver tsunami age wave means that more Minnesotans will be susceptible to this than ever before. Investment advisors and broker-dealers see the fraud being committed but have no tools available to them to prevent the transaction from going through immediately. House File 3833 works to remedy that. This bill allows that if a broker-dealer or an investment advisor reasonably believes financial exploitation of an elder or vulnerable adult is taking place, that they can notify the Commissioner of Commerce and Vulnerable Adults Act Common Entry Point. And they have the disbursement delay for up to 25 days pending an investigation. Investment advisors and broker-dealers have good faith immunity for notifying the Commissioner and Common Entry Point and delaying disbursements, giving them the tools they need to act on this fraud suspicion. And the senior and vulnerable adult maintains control over their finances. They are to be notified of the hold, and that the hold is immediately lifted if the Commissioner of Commerce, a law enforcement agency, the lead investigative agency, or the prosecuting attorney's office finds that it wasn't financial exploitation or that 15 days had passed on the initial hold. Those parties may request an additional 10 days for no more than 25 days of a hold in total. With that, Mr. Speaker, I understand we have a few amendments, and we'd like to get through those.
There is an amendment at the desk. Clerk will report the amendment.
Hillstrom moves to amend House File number 3833, the second engrossment as follows, and the amendment is coded A18-0825.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom, to introduce her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Members, I've been working with Representative Schomacker as well as the Department of Commerce to actually clear up some of the language in the proposal. Members, this first amendment actually has an additional amendment that Representative Schomacker and I and the Department of Commerce have all come to agree upon to put the bill in the shape we would all like it.
There is an amendment to the amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment to the amendment.
Schumacher moves to amend the Hillstrom amendment to House File number 3833 as follows, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A8.
I recognize the member from Rock to explain his amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and thank you, Representative Hillstrom, for your work on this to help make it a bill that works and is something that actually protects our seniors in a way that's better. The A8 just ensures that the Commissioner's determination is made within 5 days of the submission and allows for the account holder's ability to appeal the Commissioner's determination through the administrative appeals process in Chapter 14.
Discussion to the amendment to the amendment. Seeing none, all those in favor of the amendment to the amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Motion prevails. The amendment to the amendment is adopted. Discussion to the amendment as amended. Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I would encourage you to support the amendment to get the bill in the shape we'd like it.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the 0825 amendment as amended, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Motions prevail. The amendment as amended is adopted. Discussion to the bill as amended. Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Members, this puts a new standard in law. It allows broker-dealers to stop a transaction when someone is over the age of 65, whether or not they have a capacity problem. This gives a new tool to the Commissioner of Commerce to stop some of these fraudulent transactions and broker-dealers from stopping the money from going out the door. But we wanted to make sure that current law of how you stop someone from being able to spend their money in the way in which they are entitled to had some due process protections. Members, we know that everyone is free to spend their money as they choose unless you prove that they are either in need of protection, right? You get a guardianship or a conservatorship. They're a victim of a crime, and then there are criminal proceedings that happen, or you have a family or adult protection who steps in and gets an emergency order. The amendments that we added to this bill made certain that we protected seniors' ability for self-determination and spend their money the way they choose, and it gives us the tools yet to stop financial fraud and abuse. And so we believe that this has gone a long way to fix one of the challenges, and that there wasn't due process in the original proposal, and we believe that now in this shape it does, and I would encourage members to support it.
There are no more amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File Number 3833, as amended.
Third reading. The member from Olmsted, Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Schomacker please yield to a question?
He will yield. Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Schomacker, I haven't had a chance to really know a lot about this bill, but I'm intrigued by it, and it sounds like generally a good idea. But I'm still a little bit concerned about older people's ability to control their own money. Maybe it's because I'm getting uncomfortably close to the limit that's in this bill. But as we know, we have people, older people are still working and doing a lot of things in this state. I wonder if you could just give us an example of if somebody who's 66 years old has some kind of a hold put on their finances, what does the person have to do to get that released, and how quickly could it happen? I just want to have a better sense of how that's all going to work for anybody who's listening and wants to kind of picture what's happening here and what could potentially happen to anybody now who's over 65. Thank you.
Representative Schomacker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Liebling, thank you for the question there. I know that was a concern that had been raised and continues to be an issue of concern just because it is simply an age that where this goes into effect. But what would happen in the process is that if the assets were, or the transaction was frozen for that time, the financial advisor has the responsibility to let the person who owns the assets to notify them of this, and they have an appeals process at that point. They can appeal to the Commissioner of Commerce, and that's a 5-day, the Commissioner of Commerce then has 5 days to respond to that. And so if there is a need to appeal it, they can do so in that 5-day process. If the Commissioner comes back and rules that they do suspect that it is financial exploitation yet, then the consumer has the ability to appeal that. And that's where it goes into Chapter 14 with the amendments that we just adopted through the administrative process. And we would expect that that would be about a 48 to 72-hour determination on the appealing of the commissioner. If the administrative law judge rules in favor of the commissioner at that point, there's still the appeals process that would go to the district court then for the person. But it could be anywhere from as little as 2 days to as many as the 15 days or the 25 days if an extension is put on there.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Schomacker. That's helpful if he would continue to yield, Mr. Speaker. So, Representative Schomacker, is a notice given to the person whose assets are being frozen, and are there any costs that are incurred by that person to go through this appeal?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Liebling, there is a process. They do have to be notified, and there is no cost associated with that.
Further discussion? Seeing none, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. Clerk will close roll. There being 114 ayes and 8 nays, the bill as amended is passed and its title agreed to. Next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 3280. Clerk will report the bill.
House File number 3280, number 4 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to the environment, second engrossment.
I recognize the member from Aitkin, Representative Lueck, to introduce his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, House File 3280 adjusts existing state law that previously directed MPCA to develop and implement a new sulfite effluent discharge standard, commonly referred to as a wild rice sulfate standard. MPCA adopted a standard back in 1973 based on rudimentary experiments that were conducted in the 1930s and 40s. Today, there's general agreement that that standard, which is 10 parts per liter does not accurately reflect the science. During the past 45 years, MPCA has elected not to include that 1973 standard in any of the over 1,000 national pollution discharge elimination permits that they issue and manage and reissue every 5 years. Recently, MPCA attempted to add a new standard or revise the existing one, and that has ended in rejection by 2 administrative law judges. First, the law judge that oversaw the actual rulemaking process, and then on appeal, the chief judge again rejected their effort to replace this obsolete rule. In 2015, when this started on the rulemaking process, the legislature realized that we had an issue here, and we directed, the governor signed into law a bill that suspended MPCA's effort to actually enforce that 1973 standard, which they had never directly enforced to begin with. What House File 3280 does is 3 basic things. First, it reiterates already existing guidance to MPCA to refrain from trying to impose a standard that there's wide agreement that it is not based on the science of today. It lifts a deadline that is now unrealistic that would have required MPCA to complete that rulemaking by 15 January 2019. And it further restates what MPCA can and can't do relative to that old standard, basically eliminates that old standard. Those are found in sections 1, sections 3 through 8 of the bill. The second thing the bill does is it includes legislative findings. Rarely do we do that as a body, but it's very important that these findings explain precisely why we're doing what we're doing. And that's critical for a couple of reasons. First of all, we want to make it clear to our state agencies and all the citizens of Minnesota, including our tribal members, that the legislature finds wild rice to be a very important, ecologically and culturally valuable aquatic plant, and it is in fact to be protected. That's basically what Section 2 does. The third part, which is Section 9, the very end of the bill, is it brings the Department of Natural Resources back into this process, directs them to pick up and complete some research work that they began literally 10 years ago. It provides a little bit of funding to make sure they get that process going, to come back to us in January of next year to further ascertain exactly what we need to do to ensure we continue to protect wild rice. Mr. Speaker, members, that's a brief outline of the bill. This is a bipartisan effort, and in advance of the discussion today, I do want to thank Representative Metsa, Eklund, Sandstead in particular for their hard work. We've been working on this for a good while, and some of you will also remember that Representative Ansell Representative Dill, and Representative Moline also worked on this in years past. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I would stand for questions.
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Sundin moves to amend House File Number 3280. The second engrossment as follows, and the amendment is coded A10.
Recognize the member from Carleton, Representative Sundin, to explain
Thank you,
his
Mr.
amendment.
Speaker and members. We've been muddling through this issue since 1973, and if you turn back the clock a little further, back in the 40s, some of the science first came through, and we've done so very ineffectively. And I'd like to thank Representative Metsa for consulting with me on this and allowing me to carry this amendment. It's a good one, and coupled with his amendment, we can move forward on problem solving rather than contentious debates that go on behind the scenes here. So I need to reflect on a conversation that I had about 10 days ago with one of the tribal leaders from my district. He came into my office and he says, let's find solutions. Let's sit down. The science is in front of us. Let's sit down and find solutions. Is all this amendment does is actually puts a little bit of money behind the good intent of some of the people here, and coupled with the time extension from Representative Metsa, this gives tribal leaders and everybody a little bit more breathing time and some resources to find a solution rather than continue this contentious debate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There is an amendment to the amendment at the desk. Clerk will report the amendment to the amendment.
Metsa moves to amend the Sundin amendment to House File Number 3280, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A14.
I call upon the member from St. Louis to explain his amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And essentially what this amendment does is it allows one more additional year for the tribal governments, the DNR, and other stakeholders to work together to find meaningful solutions and alternatives that we know, based on some of the reportings that have come out in the 2008 legislative findings on wild rice, which I'm sure Representative Lueck can supply you all with. I want to speak to something else right now, though, too. This amendment gives us an extra year. But my understanding is this body's not going to give us anything in regard to this. We have worked as a delegation bipartisanly for quite a while on this issue, starting back with my first session down here in trying to find some meaningful solutions moving forward. And the fact that it seems like today we're going to have an amendment that goes down for $450,000 additional $450,000, a minuscule part of our budget in this state. I can't say how disappointed I am in the majority that they wouldn't accept this amendment moving forward to work on things that we know are very likely to come out of this, and that's getting rid of invasive species, cattails, adjusting dam levels. We need to know, and the dollars will show us, if we're meaningful about this today or not. If we want to find a solution that works for the sulfate standard, we should be supporting this amendment today. So I'd encourage all of you to reconsider where you're at, because this is something that goes beyond, if we're going to adjust a dam level in northern Minnesota, it's your friends, family, and neighbors' cabins whose homes could be affected on the lakes. It's getting a boat with a really cool lawnmower where they go cut down invasive cattail species to help wild rice flourish. We've worked to get a little over $400,000 in the LCCMR bill, and Representative Eklund, thank you for that. And my colleagues on the DFL side here and the Republican side, thank you for that. But today, we'll either put our money where our mouth is as a state and say we want some meaningful steps forward, or we won't. I would ask you all today to support this. We have the money in the account that it's coming out of. We have the money to do this right. This is a meaningful step forward that was worked on across the aisle with our colleagues who, some of which are still opposed to the bill, but saw this as a reasonable and meaningful thing to do. And I'll sure be disappointed if we can't take that one tiny step where we have money in the account to move forward by investing $450,000 and giving them an extra year.
Discussion to the amendment to the amendment. Representative Lueck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Metsa. I agree with the bulk of what you said. My only concern here is that having worked with both DNR and the MPCA for a number of years now, my concern is that first we see what it is they're going to do, what they expect to do before we send any money to them. So members, I would ask that we not support this amendment to the amendment, and not because the heart isn't in the right spot, but simply because after a while we get really gun shy about advancing a large amount of money to any agency without being absolutely sure what they're going to do with it. And I would only point to what MPCA has been doing for a number of years trying to deal with that standard. So again, members, I would ask that there be a no vote on the amendment to the amendment.
Further discussion to the amendment to the amendment. Seeing none, all those in favor of the amendment to the amendment, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. Motion does not prevail. The amendment to amendment is not adopted. Members, we are back on to the amendment to the bill. Further discussion. Representative Eklund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm deeply disappointed that that didn't pass. We've got the money in the account. We've worked all session to try to get this thing done and done right, and it just is slowing down the process, and I'm deeply disappointed in this body today. Thank you.
Further discussion to the A10 amendment. Seeing none, all those in favor of the amendment, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. The amendment is not adopted. There's another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Hanson moves to amend House File Number 3280. The second engrossment as follows, and the amendment is coded A12.
Call upon the member from Dakota, Representative Hanson, to introduce his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, I would ask for a roll call on the amendment.
Roll call being requested and seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Lueck, I listened very closely to your introduction, and you did say that it is rare to put in legislative findings, and I would agree. It is very rare to put in legislative findings. So would Representative Lueck yield to a question?
He will, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Lueck, where did this legislative finding come from?
Representative Lueck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. Came from a variety of sources, and in particular, if we go back to the March 23rd, 2017 letter from the Chippewa tribes of Minnesota. It was about a 5-page letter that informed the MPCA of a whole bunch of flaws in the rulemaking attempt that is basically ran off the rails with the administrative law judge people. So there's elements of that in there. There's elements in there that speaks in general terms to the problems that this would create for our wastewater treatment plants, the cost, and also with the rest of our heavy industry, including mining. So this is basically a compendium of a lot of issues that come to the fore because of this particular obsolete standard.
Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if Representative Lueck would continue to yield?
He will yield. Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And Representative Lueck, I understand what you're saying about Section A, and I would encourage members to take a look at the bill. actually take a look at the bill and look at these legislative findings. And when I look at Section B and Section C, those are a little different. And could you, particularly when I look at like lines 2.24, 2.25, 2.26, the legislature also finds certain waters of the state are used to irrigate wild rice intentionally grown as an ag crop, which is an appropriate beneficial use to be achieved and protected, and which is the only established beneficial use specifically pertaining to wild rice. So what does that mean, Representative Lueck?
Representative Lueck.
Thank you for the question. We've got 7 classes of water, and we've got Class 2, which is recreational and wildlife. We've got agriculture and wildlife also lumped into Class 4. This simply makes sure we're talking about all of the uses, and what we're talking about here is taking water out of the stream and potentially putting it into a domestic wild rice paddy. And that's just an area to make sure we've got everything cleaned up, and we're talking about all of the potential water uses relative to our watersheds.
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so when I look at that and we're talking about domestic paddy rice, I think what you're declaring in the legislative finding, it says the only established beneficial use specifically pertaining to wild rice. So that would seem to ignore the cultural, the personal, the personal feeling or use of wild rice that what I'm seeing here is we're, with a legislative finding, we're starting to muddle the waters already by establishing a beneficial use, a natural use, a finding. When I go to Section C, the legislature further finds that it's contrary to the public welfare to impose requirements or burdens on regulatory parties in Minnesota as the basis of on the basis of a water quality standard that ignores current science. That's quite a finding. I pulled out my handy Constitution, and that the object of government is instituted for the security, benefit, and protection of the people, in whom all political power is inherent, together with the right to alter, modify, or reform government whenever is required for the public good. The public good. The finding you have is talking about the regulated party's good and tying it back to public welfare, the public good versus the public welfare. Members, I would ask you again to read the findings, and that the amendment that I'm doing to take this out, Representative Lueck said it is rare to put findings in law, and I would agree. And I would ask you and encourage you to remove this. When you get into even more of Section C and Section D, we get a number of declaratory statements. I always look when we start having a lot of adjectives and adverbs with the nouns, and this is chock full of them. So again, if Representative Lueck would yield for a question, where did Section C and D come from?
He will yield. Representative Lueck.
Those sections, along with Section A, which you for some reason conveniently want to ignore, which sets the baseline, so I respectfully disagree that any one of these findings trumps Section A. They come from, again, a compendium of concerned local communities, local industry, across the board. I mean, there's no one place or that these came from. This is a compendium of a variety of things that were brought to us when we put this thing together.
Representative Hansen.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Lueck, I wasn't saying they trump Section A, but I would say that Section A, B, C, and D are very Trumpy. In terms of making declarative statements, judgments, findings, that we can often get into during the debate or in the hallways or in the discussions regarding this, but they have meaning, particularly when you put them into law. And I could ask all the lawyers in the room to comment on that, but I won't. Having the findings in here does not add to the bill. It adds to the potential litigation, it adds to more legal issues, and frankly, it's not needed. So I'd ask the members to remove this and vote for the amendment.
Further discussion to the amendment. Representative Lueck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would certainly urge that we not take these important findings out. And there's a secondary reason for this. Our Clean Water Act at the federal level, in the very beginning of that, they talk about relying on the states to develop and implement rational standards. And so not only is this a message to our own state agencies on what we value and what we hold important, and to our citizens, including all our tribal members, but this also a message directly to the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level that says, and by the way, here is why we're doing this and what we're doing. And that is very important because the day we leave session, then our agencies, MPCA in particular, will have a clear and concise set of findings when they continue discussions about developing any future rules on this subject. So I again urge a no vote on the amendment.
Further discussion to the amendment. Roll call being requested. The clerk will take the roll on the amendment. Clerk will close the roll. There being 51 ayes, 72 nays, the amendment is not adopted. There are no more amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File Number 3280.
Third reading. Discussion to the bill. Excuse me. Representative Pepin.
Mr. Speaker, this is an important issue, and I'd like to request a call to House.
Seeing 10 hands, clerk will call the roll. Clerk will close the roll. Members, we are on third reading. Any further discussion? Member from St. Louis, Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to urge members to vote no to House File 3280. House File 3280 harms our state's wild rice. Wild rice is our state's grain. It's culturally and economically important to many American Indians in Minnesota, and it provides critical habitat to game birds. The 10 parts per million sulfate standard is based on sound, scientific, academic research conducted by chemists, biologists, hydrologists, and limnologists from the University of Minnesota and from the PCA. They've conducted statewide intensive field surveys and experimental results. Researchers like Dr. Amy Mybrow, Dr. John Pastor, and Dr. Daniel Engstrom at the University of Minnesota. And they've demonstrated that sulfide produced from sulfate is harmful to wild rice at multiple stages in the plant's life. Sulfide is toxic to nearly all organisms, and the process that produces it also releases mercury. So adding more sulfate to our lakes will also lead to more mercury in the fish we catch and eat. Currently, Twin Lakes, Sandy Lake and Little Sandy Lake, have no wild rice. They are downstream from the Mintac iron ore tailings basin. In 1966, a wild rice lake survey was conducted that found dense stands of wild rice covering both lakes. After Mintac was established, a new survey was conducted in 1987. They found little to no wild rice on the lakes. They found that sulfate levels on the lakes ranged from 210 parts per million to 661 parts per million in 2010, levels that are harmful to the production of wild rice. In regards to the wastewater treatment facilities, WLSSD, based in Duluth, it is not discharging into a body of water that produces wild rice. And it could be in compliant. It's only marginally out of compliance with the 10 parts per million because the MPCA could permit variances and give them a longer time to comply. So that is not an argument of why we need to pass this bill. This bill, if passed, will lead to more litigation, which will be costly to taxpayers, and it will lead to chaos. So I, along with the Minnesota Environmental Partnership and 25 other groups, urge you to vote no on this bill. For all Minnesotans who enjoy and depend on our lakes and rivers, the risk of removing the sulfate standard is just simply too great. So I urge members to vote no.
Further discussion? Representative Metsa.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And again, I'm disappointed with our previous vote on the amendment today. We had an opportunity to continue to work bipartisanly on this issue. And I hope that as this bill makes it through to the governor's office, that we take the time to do that before the end of session. We know that it's likely to have a conference committee and that we can improve it along the way. And I did want to take a moment to thank some of our constituents from northeastern Minnesota who do work at the taconite plants, some of which were just mentioned, and clarify a couple of things as to why we care about this issue and why our community members are and will remain to be some of the best environmentalists. In the first few pages of the steelworkers' contract with the companies they work for, they're allowed to report environmental concerns without fear of losing their work. Whether it's an oil spill while they're changing the oil on a bigger truck, whether it's a leak in a dam or any other issue. I just wanted to say thank you to those members who came down today for your stewardship that you've passed on for generations to a point where right up on the Iron Range in the city of Virginia that I live in, surrounded by 3 taconite plants, that we can get our city's drinking water out of a reclaimed mine pit. Trout swim there. That's an example of what one generation passed on to another. And I hope that we're continuing to make those investments. We've got another bill out there this year that gives the NRI money to finish a research pilot project that's going on right now in my district. A bacteria that you can actually pour into a city water supply where they're doing the treatment, similar to what bacteria you'd pour into a septic tank if you were looking to get it broken down and get the solids broken down. If you electrically charge that bacteria, it will eat the sulfate, and the byproduct is iron. It also works with phosphate. This and these type of investments are what we should continue to do as a body, so that the same way that our parents and grandparents left things a little bit better for us and able to make it work so that we could get our city drinking water out of a reclaimed mine pit, that we're leaving those tools and making those investments so the next generation can do it better. So with that, I would like to say it was also a pleasure to work with our tribal communities in meeting and listening to them. Back in November, Representative Eklund and I went and met on behalf of the delegation, which is why both of us today and the rest of the delegation members are disappointed that what we brought back to the table wasn't adopted. I'm going to vote for this bill today, but I hope that in moving forward, we can make those much needed changes and continue to change the way that we're doing our politics, where we can work together and make sure that when we leave this building after passing a bill, that our kids and grandkids can be proud of what we did.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Hausman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's lots of discussion about science on this bill. It's time to hear from the scientists. You have letters on your desk from Dr. Daniel Engstrom and Dr. Amy Mirbeau. They cared enough about this issue. They are also in the gallery. The two of them have joined us in the gallery, the people who did a good bit of the work on this. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to just reference those 2 letters briefly. Dr. Engstrom identifies himself as one of the lead researchers, along with other scientists from the University of Minnesota, on the wild rice sulfate standard study. And just briefly, several of the conclusions of that study. He says they are as clear and unambiguous as the results of any environmental research I have ever conducted. And they have been vetted through peer review by a team of national and international experts. And in the last paragraph of his letter, he says, in sum, the conclusions of the wild rice sulfate standard study strongly support both the existing sulfate standard for wild rice waters as well as the PCA's proposed equation-based revision of that standard. The science supporting both the new and the old standards is far from antiquated. It represents the considered opinion of every independent scientist who has examined the evidence. The letter from Dr. Mirbeau underscores that. She's the lead author of 2 of the published studies resulting from the MPCA wild rice standard study. And she says she led the field study of 108 lakes and rivers statewide over 3 years, and again says we have unambiguous, peer-reviewed scientific results that support the sulfate standard to protect wild rice. In the MPCA letter that you have, the commissioner points out the bill prohibits the use of this new science. The bill prohibits the use of this new science regarding sulfate and wild rice. Science that Minnesotans helped pay for through the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. So we paid for this, and now we seek to nullify it. One of the handouts of the author suggests to me some of the confusion around this. The bill nullifies wild rice standards in wild rice waters. But the author's handout seems to suggest that the bill is about the mining industry. Members, we have to be very clear. Today, we have a bill not about the mining industry, not about the high cost of new wastewater infrastructure, which some have talked about. We have a bill about wild rice standards. And what this bill does is nullify sulfate standards for wild rice waters, pure and simple. I encourage a no vote.
The member from Rice, Representative Bly.
Thank you, Speaker. And I'm proud to be from Rice. Anyway, I have a question for Representative Lueck. I'm wondering if he would yield to a question.
He will yield. Representative Bly.
Representative Lueck, Section 7, Application of Water Quality Standards, Irrigation, reads, the Commissioner of the Pollution Control Agency must not apply a water quality standard established to protect water quality for purposes of permitting the water's use for irrigation without significant damage or adverse effects upon crops or vegetation, including water used for the production of wild rice, unless the water is appropriated for irrigation use. I'm not really sure I understand the purpose of that. I don't know, just in the discussion today so far, what I think we've heard from our side is that when we're thinking about the future, thinking about legislation that will govern the future, protect water, and make mining safe, we need to have a thorough discussion, and we need to know where we're headed. We need to know what we're talking about. And I know we don't talk much about climate change here, but the climate is changing, and we don't know what's going to happen to the future of northern Minnesota in regards to agriculture. And if we're, I just don't understand what you're attempting to do with this, and how is that going to affect farmers in the future? And perhaps you could explain it.
Representative Lueck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What this section deals with, and when we think about water appropriation for the purpose of irrigation, we always kind of think of, oh, that's that well out there with the big sprinkler around it. And so we're irrigating corn, beans, or some other type of thing. There's another requirement. If, for example, you do have a domestic wild rice paddy, then you just don't get to go open the creek up and pump water out of there and flood your paddy. So that is another appropriation that you have to go through the process with the DNR. So that's all we're talking about. There's nothing magic or sinister about this. It's just making sure we get everything out on the table. So we, in theory, could end up with a circumstance that if we had a standard where you could turn the appropriation down because we couldn't put it on the rice, when in fact right now we may very well be actually irrigating domestic paddies with water that's clearly above the obsolete standard.
Representative Bly.
Thank you, Speaker. So what I'm gathering from what you're saying is that you're interested in protecting the domestic paddy rice, but not necessarily the wild rice. Is that correct? Would you yield for a question?
He will yield. Representative Lueck.
Well, my good friend, you're absolutely wrong. Thank you.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I've heard a lot of talk about tribal leaders, discussion with tribal leaders, industry, regulators, legislators, trying to figure out the best approach to go forward. And I appreciate all that work, and people have, they have the best interests of their community. They're trying to work with other communities, with tribal leaders. But we forget that there is a higher authority, and for Ojibwe people, that is women. And women are the carriers of the water, and wild rice is part of the Ojibwe origin story. And so I look to Ojibwe elders, to women, to hear what they have to say about this issue. And what they say, well, first every summer they walk along the rivers of the U.S., thousands of miles over the last 5 years, to care for the water. And they're the water walks, and I think some of you are probably familiar, Sharon Day. And so what do they say? They say, why are they walking? They say that we don't want to fight with others. We don't want to fight with the mining industry. We don't want to fight with our neighbors, our friends. So we want to work with you. And she invites everyone to walk with her to care for the water. And so the role of women, it has always been that women care for the water by offering prayers to the water and by carrying the water. And so when at the time that the treaties were treaty making era, treaties are supposed to be interpreted as Indian people understood them at the time. And that's a U.S. Supreme Court rule of construction. But think about at the time what the concept of for Europeans about ownership and of land and waters. But Ojibwe people don't have a word for ownership in their language. And if you listen to Dr. Anton Truer, who's a historian, he talks about in Ojibwe language, the only comparable word is measure, is our relation to the land, to the water. And so at that time, what did they understand? When the treaties were first started mainly in New England, the treaties were peace and friendship treaties. At that time, tribes, nations were great powers, and so they entered into treaties for friendship and peace so that they could help, whether it was the English or the Spanish or the French. They were claiming that they had a right to certain lands and to conquest. And so they relied on Indians to protect them, so that they would agree that they would not support the English. The English would enter a treaty so they wouldn't support the French, and so that they would be allies. And then later, as Spain and France and Britain, English became stronger, then the treaties became cessions. And so because Indians, tribes, pre-exist the Constitution, they had seen as having inherent rights. And so those inherent rights were centered around this measure, this relation to the land. And so they, at the time, understood that they were ceding lands, but they were reserving that they would have a way to continue to live and to feed their people and to hunt and fish and gather. And so on these ceded lands where these wild rice grow, they can be viewed as property interests. We call them, in the English, we call them usufruct. They're held in common ownership. And that property right is that you can use that property in common as long as you don't harm it, you don't destroy it, you don't diminish it. And that is how I think that Indian people view those areas today, those ceded lands, that they are held in common, and that we all have a responsibility to care for those waters, those lands. And so this is not the way to do that, obviously. It only leads to more conflict, to litigation, and then, the rest of us, all of us tribal attorneys have to get out our koans and start looking up usufruct rights and start going to the U.S. Supreme Court to enforce, because those treaties are still there. They may have been broken, by the federal government, but unless they're abrogated by Congress, they are still there. And that was the understanding, that these waters, these land, wild rice, that they would be held in common, and that others would not, everyone would agree that they are not to be destroyed, not to be damaged, not to be diminished. So we need to find a way going forward to care for those, to care for the wild rice. Thank you.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Kunesh-Podein. The member from Hennepin, Representative Flanagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I rise today to speak in opposition of this bill. I have two letters that I've passed out that you'll find on your desk, one from the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, of which I am a member, and one from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. Representative Lueck talked about including our tribal members, talked about what kind of message we want to send to the tribes. Well, I think the message has been received. The tribes have come together, at least the MCT, the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, to say no. I spent a little bit of time lately traveling across the state and having conversations with tribes and tribal leaders. What I have heard consistently from tribal leaders is they want meaningful consultation. Frankly, it's all we've ever wanted, is meaningful consultation. There's an opportunity for us to come up with a science-based solution, but also to come up with a culturally based solution. These things need not be forces that are working against each other, but can work together. As Representative Allen so eloquently talked about treaty rights, which are, by the way, a supreme law of the land, too often, Native people has been seen as an obstacle, what you might call a quote-unquote Indian problem. And what this bill threatens to do is it threatens our very existence as Native people. And here's how. I'm going to read directly from the letter from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe because they say it better than I ever could. As Anishinaabe people, we have many traditions and cultural traits that we hold sacred, none more than Menomen, or wild rice. Ojibwe prophecy, which we hold as natural law, states that we are instructed by the Creator to follow the Migis, or cowrie shell, west along the Great Lakes until we reach the place where food grows on water. Our ancestors were told that this is sacred food that will sustain and provide life for the Ojibwe to live here in what is now known as Minnesota forever. For generations, Anishinaabe people have kept these waters, the Menomen stronghold they are today. And it was not through legislation or research, but through respect. The significance of that Menomen holds to Ojibwe people cannot be overstated. And I think it's possible for us to take a step back and work together. But this is not the way. This is not the way. Most of the time when I stand up here on the floor and I speak, it's on issues that affect Native people. And I am grateful for the other Indigenous members of this body. But I think it's time that everyone on both sides of the aisle take very seriously our responsibility to work and to maintain relationships that are government-to-government relationships. We are not a race of people. We are sovereigns. We are sovereign nations. And we have a responsibility as lawmakers to respect those relationships. So colleagues, I think, and I am hopeful, that the tribes want to come to the table and work in partnership with us to find a better standard where we can come together, where that science and that culture can meet. And I am eager to be part of those conversations, as I hope you are all as well. But if wild rice no longer exists, we no longer exist. Many of us in this body talk about where our ancestors come from, our immigration story. For half of my family, there's a story of a 16-year-old who brought her family across the ocean without her parents and fought and struggled. And Mary Harrigan's blood runs through my veins. But on the other side of my family, we were here. This is our home. We can't go anywhere else. This is who we are, this is where we live, and this is where we are from. So if Monoman, if wild rice goes away, so do we. Maybe that's the point. Thank you.
The member from Nicollet, Representative Johnson C.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, I think the last two speeches have said something very powerful to us. I don't often talk about it. I don't know if I've talked about it on the House floor, but many years ago, about 40 years ago, in fact, I served as a legislative assistant to Senator Quentin Burdick. He was a senator from North Dakota, and I worked in Washington, D.C. And I had really the honor, and I mean the honor, of handling the Indian Affairs portfolio for Senator Burdick. And Senator Burdick had a distinct relationship with the tribes that was born of respect. And I think when I reflect on it today with this bill, it's very apt, and I think I want to share fundamentally what that really a great North Dakota senator taught me. It's a lesson that I learned 40 years ago, but it's a timeless lesson. The first fundamental lesson that he taught me was just to deeply respect the sovereignty of the tribes. You don't often hear that from non-Indian people. You did from Quentin Burdick, and today you're hearing it from Clark Johnson. That we have to, as a people, deeply respect the sovereignty of our tribes. It's fundamental to the relationship we have had, have today, and more importantly, we need going forward. I had the opportunity many times to sit with him in the office, and the tribes would come in and he'd say, I remember Rose Crowflies High from the 3 affiliated tribes. And he'd say, Chief, he'd say, what do you need? And she would lay out what their goals were coming to Washington, D.C. He'd point to me and he'd say, listen to this, let's see what we can do for this tribe, for the tribe. The second lesson that I learned from Senator Burdick was to always listen and treat with respect the viewpoints of the tribal people, the viewpoints of the Native people on issues that are critically important to them. I think the last two speakers made it real clear. This is an issue that's critically important to the tribes. It's demonstrated clearly in the letters that we received today. So the lessons that I learned 40 years ago, I encourage you to adhere to as well today. Show the respect for sovereignty of those tribes and to listen and respect those views expressed by the tribal people. We do that today by voting no on this bill.
The member from Roseau, Representative Fabian.
Well, thank you, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and members. You know, the question was asked earlier, why are we here today? I'm not an attorney, nor do I want to be, I would encourage members to go and take a look at the Chief ALJ's ruling that came out recently. And let me start by saying we all want abundant wild rice. You know, the notion that we don't, I don't find that to be very helpful. I think that we all do, and I think that we should all work together in a collaborative way to make sure that we do guarantee that. But the fact of the matter, members, is that the 10 milligram per liter numeric standard is a standard that was adopted in the 70s, and members, it has never, until recently, been written into a permit. The 10 milligrams per liter standard, the numeric standard, has never been enforced, ever. So we need to take an objective look at where are we and where are we going. And the Chief Administrative Law Judge, in her ruling recently, lays out a pretty clear path about what should happen. And in her ruling, she talks about the Minnesota Administrative Procedures Act. And I don't know if you've read the report or not, but if there is a legal woodshed to be taken to, I think the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has been taken to the Administrative Law Judge's, Chief Administrative Law Judge's legal woodshed. In her ruling, she says that in the case of this, the MPCA has failed to meet this and other requirements of the Administrative Procedures Act, and therefore she ruled to disapprove the rule as they brought it forward, the new one, the equation-based. It also says in her ruling that the MPCA has not complied with the law in this regard. It does not follow the Chief Administrative Law Judge's directives regarding how to correct the defects in the proposed rule, nor has it submitted the disapproved rule to the identified legislative bodies, of which we are. Instead, the MPCA has in effect requested reconsideration of the rule's disapproval and seeks an order allowing adoption of the proposed rule in a modified form. The agency has also not followed the provided directives for curing all identified defects, nor identified other record-based and public vetted solutions to achieve the same ends consistent with the spirit and the letter of the Minnesota Administrative Procedures Act. Neither has the agency availed itself of the only other statutory alternative, which is seeking legislative advice as required by law. She also goes on to say in here that, in fact, the MPCA is correct, and there's other things like that in this ruling. And then with regards to the equation-based standard that MPCA is pushing, she said in her ruling that the proposed standard becomes not a measuring stick, but a slide rule. It's difficult to conclude that such a process could ever, quote, given a person of ordinary intelligence a reasonable opportunity to know what is prohibited or provide sufficient standards for enforcement, unquote. I could go on and talk about this, but I encourage members to take a look at this, and let's come back to a conversation about that. I would also point out that in March of 2015, Governor Dayton said that, quote, some people will say you're going to abandon the standard, but if the standard is obsolete and it's not validated by current science and information, then stick with it and close down an industry really isn't well advised. Also, he said, if you have an impossibly low standard that doesn't correlate the problem that you're trying to solve anyway, you put the whole industry out of business. We don't even know if it's going to improve wild rice conditions, and it's going to be catastrophic for life up in northeastern Minnesota. I'm a pro-mining guy, but I'm also interested in the cities, and you probably got the handouts at your desk of what the many millions of dollars of costs are going to be to meet the numeric standard or to meet another standard. Members, we need to go back. We need to figure out where to start on this process, and let's solve a problem, and let's give the agencies the tools that they need to get this done I encourage a green vote. Representative Lueck, thank you for the work you've done. Representative Metza and Eklund and Sandsteed and so forth, I appreciate the work. Let's keep working together and get this right. I encourage a green vote on the bill. Thank you.
The member from St. Louis, Representative Sandstead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, or Speaker. Members, I've listened to this debate for a long time, sometimes as a resident of the area I represent, and now most recently as the person who represents that area. And I've had a couple questions, and I've had a couple final thoughts that I just want to share with you. Some questions I've had as I've listened to this debate for many years is, why do we have this standard? What happened in 1973 that we needed a standard around wild rice? To date, I haven't been able to get that answer from any agency or an individual. So I know that different times warrant different policy, but I'm sure it was put in there for a reason. I just don't know what that was. With that being said, I wonder, do we need that now? Maybe we do. I'm not debating the issue. Perhaps we do. This is a standard for wild rice. This is not a standard that's here to divide people, attack culture, attack jobs, go after communities. It's a standard around wild rice. And I'm going to ask you just to think about this question. If we need a standard, then is it reasonable to have a standard that encompasses the whole picture? Or should we just isolate a pixel of the picture and have a standard centered on a pixel? And what we have currently is a pixel. Every argument I've heard on the floor, every position I've heard on the floor has merit. To my friends on this side of the aisle and my friends on that side of the aisle, there is a solution for all of us. What I've heard today is what my heart is after. I'm after genuine solutions. And since 1973, we have not come to the table. We have not come together to find a genuine solution. We have been creating, perpetuating wedge issues. I'm not interested in that. I was not elected to do that. Mr. Speaker, will my friend Rep. Allen yield to a question?
She will yield. Representative Sandstead.
Taking into the account that this is a complex issue and there's cultural impact, in your opinion, what is the solution? How do we come together?
Representative Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, there is one of the regulators states in here that this bill prevent the MCPA from moving forward with the rulemaking to revise Minnesota's water quality standard to protect wild rice from the adverse impacts of sulfate. That is, this bill doesn't solve any problems. So how do we come together, the question? We don't adhere very well to process, to consultation, to going out into communities. I mean, you have in up north communities that have coexisted, lived together, intermarried, work for each other. They've figured out how to deal with this issue. That's where the answer is. We're not going to come up with that answer here, but they will. But they need resources to do that, and they need alternatives, and they need somebody to help facilitate that process to move them to the next step. There is the will to do that there. These people are not
these people live and work together. They understand each other, they do have respect for each other, and they understand the economic hardships and the things that they struggle with and the barriers. So they are the best people to solve this problem.
Representative Sandsted.
Thank you. And thank you to my friend, Rep. Allen. My heart is to come together on this. My heart is to find the right solution. And I'm going to be supporting this bill because what we have in place right now is flawed, seriously. And my support is not against a tribal community. It's not against people. It's not a divisive issue. It is to come together. And since 1973, apparently this body and others haven't found a path forward. It's sad if it takes a lawsuit for us to do that, but maybe that's what it takes. I urge your support.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. Thank you, Representative Allen, Representative Flanagan, for helping me, and I hope everyone here understand the true meaning of wild rice. This bill is a pretend solution to a real problem. This bill, with its findings, takes away all standards by pretending that sulfates are not a problem. So what would happen if pretend was signed into law? PCA has testified that without a standard, it would be difficult to approve permits for new or expanded facilities. And here's why. If PCA doesn't include a 10 milligram standard, then the permit would not meet the already federally approved standard or the new science that reinforces, not negates, but reinforces the standard, the old one. On the other hand, if PCA issued a permit with the standard and this law passed, then PCA would be breaking the law. So what pretending does here is buy a gigantic lawsuit for each and every wastewater facility treatment plant that wants a new or expanded permit. It doesn't make it easier, it makes it harder and more expensive. You've heard the argument, well, it's not been enforced in the past, so it doesn't have to be enforced in the future. But that argument is flawed, and here's why. It pretends that the legislature didn't ask for a new study, didn't fund a new study that had a standard that actually reinforces the old standard. This legislative activity, the funding, the request, are now part of the record. They can't be ignored. So now we're back to pretending when we should be problem solving. People are saying problem solve. Pretending is not problem solving. A red vote here is in favor of problem solving.
The member from Aiken, Representative Lueck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, members. Couple of things. First of all, on the matter of not listening to our brothers and sisters, tribal members, if you take a look at those findings, some of those words are literally lifted right out of documents that were sent barely a year ago to MPCA, signed by 6 tribal chairmen and women that laid out the very issues that our state agency has not performed on, and starts with recognition first and foremost, that's priceless value to the people of Minnesota. We're talking about wild rice. And it goes on for a couple pages, and then right at the end, and they're talking about the standard that was literally destroyed, as Representative Fabian spoke of, by the administrative law judge folks. Propose a complicated, difficult to implement equation for deriving site-specific criteria that itself relies upon data that the state currently does not have. So I don't accept the premise that at least I am not listening. I've been looking at this for 4 years, and there's a huge amount of stuff related to this bill that comes directly from the tribes, and they're not just in their documents, but discussions. I too have a Mille Lacs band. A third of their people reside in the district that I represent, and so I speak with them quite often, and I understand and appreciate the absolute suspicion and frustration anytime any government, whether it's federal or state, tries to tinker with anything that our tribal friends hold near and dear to their heart, because we all have to recognize that if you look back for the last 400 or 500 years, it's not worked out very well. But I just want to assure and state for the record, I am one that's listening, and I'm borrowing some of the very elements that were put forward over the past couple of years to our state agencies that they've ignored. So I'll say no more on that. There's a concern about mercury. If you look at some of the handouts, there's a little quick thing there. 90% of the mercury issues that we have that gets into the water, that gets consumed by our wildlife, comes from outside the state. There is a tiny fraction that may come as a result of mining. It's significantly more than simply generating when we generate power here in the state of Minnesota. So, frankly, we don't want mercury any place where it doesn't belong, obviously, but that is a red herring that this sulfite standard is going to have some major change in the mercury that falls out of the sky. So that's another one that we need to understand and be realistic about and accept the current knowledge that we have. With respect to, as Representative Sandstead spoke of, our local communities, in particular cities with wastewater treatment plants. This applies not just to Northeast Minnesota. See, there's a big fallacy. If you look at one of the other handouts, it says map of Minnesota, and it's got all kinds of little square boxes on it. You'll note there's wild rice waters at the border with Iowa. So while the focus is on Northeast Minnesota, basically north of Mille Lacs Lake in particular, this is not an issue that is just simply a localized thing. So, and again, that goes back to something that our Native American friends have been telling us from day one. You guys are discriminating, you're picking a few winners and losers. I absolutely am committed. This is a statewide problem. Wherever there was wild rice, we need to understand that, and where it's possible, restore it. Talking about jobs, we've got a huge amount of folks here that depend in the trades on mining, on manufacturing, and all kinds of things. Steel workers, carpenters union, electricians, boiler makers, goes on and on. 49ers. This is a real part of what they do, and the production of steel is a kind of a fundamental thing to manufacturing here, both in the state of Minnesota and across the country. So this is a absolutely sincere effort to move the ball forward, to get us focused on pragmatic improvements to protecting and enhancing wild rice. And we need to just kind of clear the deck here. Let MPCA go back to the starting point. There's nothing in here that prohibits them from taking the science that we have today and any that shows up in the future and moving it forward again. I mean, it was very clear. Administrative law judge says you can't ever do this, and nor do we. In fact, I personally encourage it, as does the legislature. That's what MPCA does. So with that, I would encourage everybody to support this. It by no means removes anything from relative to protection of the environment. Let's be honest. We haven't been doing it. So let's be honest. And to not admit that and say, you know, we need to take a turn in the other direction and go out there and fix this stuff, that's where I'm at on it. So again, members, I would just encourage a positive yes vote on this, and we will continue to move the ball forward because what it's about is protecting the wild rice. Thank you, members.
Clerk will take the roll. Members, reminder that the House is under call. Clerk will close the roll. There being 78 ayes, 45 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. Representative Pepin.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the call of the House be lifted.
Representative Pepin moves that further proceedings that the call of the House is lifted. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Motion prevails.
The next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 817. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 817, an act relating to public safety, number 5 on the calendar for the day, the second engrossment.
Recognize the member from Scott, Representative Loonan, to introduce your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. House File 817 deals with identity theft. The technology the criminals are using now gets more and more advanced, and we have a gap in our enforcement laws, our current enforcement laws, that allows people to open the front of ATMs and gas pumps. So let's say little Johnny's got his job after school at the gas station, and he sees somebody open up the front of the gas pump. The way the current law reads, all he can do is go and have that person leave. House File 18 will change all that and have him just call the police and have the person arrested who's trying to put the skimmer inside the gas pump. This also works with ATMs. This tries to anticipate future technology that these criminals will use, so you don't just, it isn't forbid just physically entering the gas pump or ATM, but using any type of electronic application to do it as well. And I stand for any questions.
There are no amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File number 817.
Third reading. Discussion on House File 817. Seeing no discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. There being 123 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. Report from the Committee on Rules and Legislative Administration.
Pepin from the Committee on Rules and Legislative Administration, pursuant to Rules 1.21 and 3.33, designates the following bills to be placed on the calendar for the day for Wednesday, April 25th, 2018, and establishes a pre-filing requirement for amendments offered to the following bills. House File numbers 2743, 3225, 3290, 1609, and 3210.
Announcements by the Speaker.
Announcement by the Speaker, a message from the Senate has been received requesting concurrence by the House to amendments adopted by the Senate to the following House File. House File number 3157.
Motions and resolutions. There are copies of the non-controversial motions at the House desk and online. If there's no objection, we'll take action on these motions first. Hearing no objection, the motions prevail. There is a motion at the desk. The clerk will report the motion.
O'Driscoll moves that House File number 3688, now on the General Register, be re-referred to the Committee on Ways and Means.
Recognize the member from Stearns, Representative O'Driscoll, to your motion.
Mr. Speaker, that is my motion. This is the PACE bill, the property assessed clean energy bill. Appears that a couple of members haven't seen it in their committee yet and would like to see it again. So we had an issue in provision with Commerce. We just want to pull it from the General Register, take it through Ways and Means, get that resolved, and put it right back on the General Register, Mr. Speaker.
Discussion on the O'Driscoll motion. Seeing no discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails. Announcements. The member from Hennepin, Representative Carlson L.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the DFL members of Ways and Means will be meeting immediately after session in room 272.
Announcements. The member from Hennepin, Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to recognize the chess team from the Robbinsdale Spanish Immersion School, which finished first out of 45 teams in the School Chess Association statewide primary championship tournament this past weekend. The tournament was pretty dramatic. It was supposed to be 2 weekends ago, but part of it had to be postponed because of bad weather. The Robbinsdale Spanish Immersion team was led by Alexander Brown, who was the state individual champion with 6.5 points. There were also strong showings by Nora Littman with 5.5 points, Griffin Schmidt with 5.5 points, and a student who happens to be named Rose Freiberg with 5 points. So please join me in congratulating the chess team from Robbinsdale Spanish Immersion.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Knobloch, for announcements.
Mr. Speaker, members, the Republican members of the Ways and Means Committee will meet in room 454 to huddle immediately after session. The full Ways and Means Committee will meet at 4 o'clock in room 200 to take up the Education, Finance, and Higher Education bill.
Any further announcements? The member from Hennepin, Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 10 a.m. Thursday, April 24th, 2018. Tuesday, 10 a.m. Tuesday, April 24th, 2018, just like I said.
Representative Pepin very clearly moved that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 10 o'clock a.m. on Tuesday, April 24th, 2018. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails. Representative Pepin.
I move that the House do now adjourn.
Representative Pepin moves that the House do now adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the House stands adjourned until 10 o'clock a.m. on Tuesday, April 24th, 2018.